There is a photograph that occasionally resurfaces online and looks like something from a horror movie. It shows a massive Disney sea serpent, half submerged in dark water, coated in algae, staring into nothing. The photograph was not taken in some forgotten roadside park. It was taken inside Magic Kingdom, above an 11.5 million gallon lagoon. And one of the submarines from that ride is still underwater today. The ride was called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Submarine Voyage. And to understand why Disney built it, you have to understand what submarines meant in 1959. The Cold War had turned them into objects of fascination. They could vanish beneath the ocean for months, cross the globe in silence, surface without warning. Most Americans had never been inside one. Walt Disney recognized the power of that mystery. In 1959, Disneyland opened Submarine Voyage, letting ordinary families board bright yellow submarines and descend below the surface of a massive lagoon. Through round portholes, guests watched coral reefs drift past, sea creatures glide by, shipwrecks emerge from the dark. The submarines never actually dove deep. They traveled along a hidden track just beneath the surface, while bubbles and shifting light created the illusion of descent. It became one of Disneyland's biggest hits. When Walt Disney World opened in Florida on October 1, 1971, the concept returned in a far more ambitious form. Imagineers built an entirely new lagoon inside Fantasyland, filling it with 11.5 million gallons of water. The attraction consumed roughly 1/4 of all available space in that section of the park. 12 submarines, each carrying 40 guests at a time, traveled a hidden underwater track through coral reefs, glowing sea caves, and the ruins of a sunken civilization. The ride lasted 20 minutes from boarding to disembarkation, an extraordinary commitment of time when most attractions moved guests through in 4 or 5. You descend a narrow spiral staircase into the hull. The hatch closes above you. Engines hum. Bubbles rush past the portholes, and the water shifts from bright turquoise to a blue so deep it looks like night. Then the ruins of Atlantis appear, crumbling statues half buried in sand, lit from below by a sourceless amber glow. Near the end, a giant squid wraps its tentacles around Captain Nemo's Nautilus. Children pressed their faces against the glass. The attraction quickly earned E-ticket status, the highest designation Disney offered, reserved for the park's most significant rides. It was, by nearly every measure, one of the most beloved things Disney had built in Florida, and one of the most expensive to keep running. The same engineering that made it extraordinary contained the problem that would eventually kill it. That problem was present before a single guest boarded. The flaw was not a broken part. It was a ratio, and the ratio was never survivable. 20 employees were required to operate the ride on any given day. Maintenance divers entered the lagoon regularly to repair submerged animatronics corroded by constant water exposure and Florida's mineral-heavy groundwater. The filtration system for 11.5 million gallons ran continuously. Each submarine had its own diesel-powered drive system, meaning mechanical failures were frequent. The boarding process created a structural bottleneck no redesign could fix. The hourly guest capacity was dramatically lower than any other major attraction of comparable footprint. Rides surrounding the lagoon could cycle thousands of guests per hour. The submarines could not come close. That problem existed from October 14, 1971, the day the ride opened, 2 weeks behind schedule because of infrastructure problems with the lagoon itself. It never improved. It only compounded. By the early 1990s, the ride was over 20 years old. Space Mountain had been transformed. Star Tours and Splash Mountain had redefined what theme park technology could do. Guests occasionally noticed wires controlling the animatronics or maintenance divers swimming through a scene mid-ride. The illusion was fraying. In 1992, Euro Disney opened outside Paris carrying enormous debt, placing financial pressure across the entire Walt Disney Company. Managers began scrutinizing cost centers with new urgency. The submarine ride sat at the top of that list. And here is where the story turns strange. On September 5th, 1994, Disney closed 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The announcement called it a temporary closure for refurbishment. Nobody panicked. The official timeline suggested the ride would reopen by the summer of 1996. Guests walked past the lagoon and assumed something quiet was being improved beneath the surface. Nothing happened. No construction crews appeared. The submarines sat parked along the track exactly where they had been left. The lagoon stayed full. Then, according to accounts documented by theme park historians, something remarkable occurred. In early 1995, Michael Ovitz, then president of the Walt Disney Company, visited Magic Kingdom and asked about the prospects for reopening 20,000 Leagues. Park operations informed him the ride was in significantly deteriorated condition. Ovitz was skeptical and demanded to see the attraction for himself. What happened next, according to these accounts, was a carefully staged demonstration. Operations selected the worst submarine in the fleet and took Ovitz on board at 7 in the morning before the park opened. During the ride, crew members poured buckets of water into the cabin to simulate a hull leak. Ovitz left convinced the attraction could not be economically rehabilitated. The part of this story most people do not know is what Disney did with the water. In April 1996, the closure was made officially permanent. The submarines were pulled from the lagoon and moved to backstage storage. But the lagoon itself, all 11.5 million gallons, stayed exactly where it was. Disney did not drain it. The entire underwater world of 20,000 Leagues, the Atlantis sets, the animatronic sea creatures, the coral reef props built into the lagoon floor in 1971, remained submerged inside an active, fully functioning theme park. Disney even repurposed the surface. Ariel's grotto opened along one edge, a character meet and greet, where guests lined up to pose with the Little Mermaid. A King Triton statue spouted water across the surface. Children stood at the railing, looking out across the lagoon, unaware they were standing above an abandoned ride. Guests who looked carefully through the surface on a clear morning could still see the ride track running along the lagoon floor. Thousands of people walked past it every day and saw nothing unusual. 8 years. The attraction was gone. The lagoon pretended to be something else entirely. In 2004, Disney finally drained the lagoon for the first time since 1971. When the water level dropped below the ride track, workers found the entire underwater set still in place, largely undisturbed. Atlantis statues stood in their original positions. Animatronic sea creatures remained mounted to their armatures, coated in layers of algae and fine sediment. Coral reef props sat on the floor. The track ran along the drained bottom like a path through ruins, nobody had entered in a decade. Disney artist and historian Kevin Kidney later documented and worked to preserve pieces of original ride props that survived the drain, including hand-painted coral elements from the 1971 construction that still held their color beneath the sediment. Most of the 12-vessel fleet was crushed and buried in a Walt Disney World landfill on Disney property in Orange County. The lagoon was filled in with soil and construction material. 23 years of operation. 8 years submerged. 11.5 million gallons drained. Most of the fleet in a landfill. But this story has one more chapter. Before the rest of the fleet was buried, 2 submarines were pulled from storage and transported to Castaway Cay, Disney's private island in the Bahamas, and lowered into the snorkeling lagoon used by guests arriving on Disney Cruise Line ships. Workers covered the hulls with cargo netting to give coral and sea life a surface to attach to. Over time, actual coral grew across the hulls. Real fish moved through the cabins where families had once sat watching fabricated sea creatures through Florida lagoon glass. One of the 2 submarines was later destroyed by severe hurricane weather. The other, according to documented accounts from Disney historians and fan communities who have tracked its presence, is still there. Guests on Disney cruises swim past it on vacation, most of them without any idea what they are looking at. Some notice a porthole and wonder. A few recognize the shape and understand. The submarine that spent its entire operational life traveling along a hidden track in a landlocked Florida lagoon, pretending to sink to the ocean floor, ended up resting on an actual ocean floor, not performing depth, surrounded by it. It is still underwater. If you rode 20,000 leagues under the sea before it closed in 1994, leave the year in the comments. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe.